It's not like
You're absolutely right, Dave. Today is a national holiday. It's opening day.
indeed.
Opening day of baseball,
I
Thursday,
guess
March 26th.
I guess technically the Yankees played yesterday.
They did. They did. Opening night. Opening night.
Yeah,
Did you watch the game?
opening night. No, I didn't. I got home late last night and then I'm dealing with a whole sick household.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
That's all right.
I don't have the sick household, but I also came home late. I had an environmental advisory council meeting, which had a brief meeting, a crisp 3 hours and 15 minutes. Usually they're at the 4 hour mark. It's a good committee, good council. They do a lot of work, but it's long. So it makes for a long night. Yeah.
I'm
Believe it.
glad you were able to get on this morning. And we all, want to say shout out to Brandon, who's hanging out in Ireland.
Yes,
We
my heart
miss
goes
him.
out to Brandon Ford traveling with the International City Management Association Executive Board to Ireland. Yeah. I can't believe he's not calling in from Ireland. I'd be happy
Yeah, I mean, that would have
for
been so
that.
cool. What
That or
time is
take the
it there?
podcast on the road, right? We could have gone there.
We could have done it on location. Generation on the Rise from the Blarney Stone.
Yeah.
I feel like
Well,
eventually this podcast will go international. There'll be
yeah.
some event where the three of us are, probably like ICMA Montreal or something.
Antarctica. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Antarctica.
Yeah.
This guy. That's so
With
funny.
the narwhals.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, Dave, I was saying before we press record, had I realized you were going to wear your Phillies gear, I would have worn my Phillies gear in support. I consider today to be like a national holiday. I'm so excited. I
Yeah,
just
indeed.
woke up feeling rejuvenated. It is finally spring. Baseball season is here. I feel like when it's not baseball season, I'm just looking out the window waiting for it to be baseball season again.
Well, I don't want to dampen your excitement, but they're calling for big storms here. What are they calling for out your way? We have like
I think it's going to
79
rain,
degrees.
but baseball is is a sport you can play in
Rain or
some
shine.
rain anyway.
Some rain.
It's a high of 76, partly cloudy,
Beautiful.
precipitation 2%, according to
Beautiful.
I'm a Weather Underground app guy. I don't know where you get your weather.
That's a
Weather
better
Underground is that the
forecast.
app you use?
Yeah, Weather Underground for sure.
Yeah. I
What
discovered that recently, but
what are you feeling about the Phillies prospects this year? You feeling good? Is it going to be
yeah, I'm not sure if we take the division. I think we win 93 games. I'll say 93. I'll take 93. I think we make the playoffs and we'll see sort of what happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll go 85 to 90 games. I don't think we're going to get to 100. I think it's
No,
going to
this is
be
not a 100-win season.
It's not a 100-win
because
season.
these guys are getting older and they're going to start
Right.
resting them, right? I mean, did you see sort of the conversation of like, can we keep Stubbsy? Can he play the field? That's all about, more utility players who are sort of versatile and can give some of the older guys breaks, right? I love JT Realmuto. I'm happy that we're running it back. I think he's a leader in the clubhouse. I think the pitching staff loves him. Did I think it was the best re-sign? I don't. But he rested
Yeah.
a lot last year. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
he did. It's a tough position.
It's an
and-
aging roster. It's a tough position.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's not a 100-game. It's not a 100-game season. I think it's a 93 season, and I'm prepared. Do you want to bet like $5 on that? It seems like you're taking the under. You said 85 to 90, and I'm saying I'll take over 90. What do
Over
you
90
think?
and I'll take under 90. Yeah, $5, sure, why not?
All right, well, we can make it $1.50. I don't want to put you out here.
Well, I mean, you got to
Yeah.
adjust for inflation. Times are
Oh
hard.
my
but
God! Well, times are hard. Yeah. That's
I'm
true.
just feeling really good about the fact that you two are starting this show off like on the same page, that you're really like
We're just ready.
common fans of the Phillies. And does this mean I'm going to be the one that's going to have to be controversial here today? Because I
Yeah,
think
it
I
may
might
be.
be.
There's now Dave and I.
Shock
Yeah.
jock.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think
I was
there's some
talking to-
real. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Nancy.
I was
I
going to
was gonna
say there
say
are
anything
some
significant.
generational issues in this topic that I know you're about to introduce on connectivity. And I think our perspectives, just based on when we were born,
Are
have
going to
a
be different.
Big different.
So let's talk about the topic. So welcome. This is Generation on the Rise. Every week or almost every week, we sort of do this, right? We kick a topic around. I'm joined here by Dave Proboka and Nancy Hess, who, for those who don't know, is our executive producer. This podcast literally would not be possible without Nancy not only corralling the three of us, but doing all of the background work in terms of editing and broadcasting and all that stuff, publishing. Nancy, we appreciate it, and we appreciate you sort of
Yes.
being behind the mic here with us this morning to make sure Dave and I don't duke it out too bad. So we're going to talk connectivity. transportation, multimodal transportation, getting people around this planet and also around your small towns is complicated. And the way that that is viewed, I believe, in the municipalities that we work in is changing, right? I mean, more and more, I'm having folks come in and they're sort of running on platforms or they're talking to me about the Strong Town movement, right? 10 years ago, most communities weren't talking about that. They're talking about, sidewalks and bike lanes and trails and, how do we sort of connect our neighborhoods to each other? How do we connect sort of urban spots to maybe rural amenities? How do we get them to maybe our parks facilities from where they are without having to get into a car? I attended a committee meeting recently where people, relevant to the conversation sort of said, this is a car centric country, but that doesn't mean we need to be a car centric community. That's a hot take. We can really
Yeah.
start to unpack that.
Edith, would
And,
you,
and
if you
go
would
ahead.
explain that Strong Town movement too, I think that's
Yeah.
important just to get off with
I
listeners
certainly can.
understand.
If you're in front of a computer, either now or later, please Google Strongtown. So there is an individual, and I don't want to mess his name up, so I'm looking it up here, who founded the Strongtown movement, which is essentially saying exactly what it sounds like, right? So it's Chuck Maroon
Mhm.
founded the Strongtown movement, and there's a book called Strongtowns. He's actually published a few books where he's sort of saying that our communities are the bedrock of who we are in the United States of America, right? And when we think about our small, in Pennsylvania, we call them boroughs, but our small towns are urban centers where sort of the merchants and the bakers and the business owners are, they sort of create the community that we have. But the movement sort of talks about that we've gotten away from that, that there's some of these towns become a place that we maybe sleep and not a place where we live, where we sort of experience, our neighbors and our community and all of the things that sort of take a neighborhood and make it into a community or a town. And their point is that from an infrastructure perspective, there are things that you can do or not do that can make your town stronger and make people feel a sense of belonging or a sense of place where they live. And that when we prioritize certain things over others, like cars, for example, that we maybe sort of lose that, right? Think about it. If you live in a 1 square mile town, where there's tons of businesses and, restaurants and, things for you to do, parks for you to go to, but you can't access any of it, well, that's going to give you a different feeling of connection emotionally and otherwise to those amenities than if you were able to sort of walk out your door and participate in the community that's around you. And so the Strongtown movement has lots of different sort of things that it pushes, parking requirements. It talks about that. What do our, sort of high density projects, residential projects look like? Widths of our streets, outside dining, all of these things are sort of a part of that. And they can create belonging around, where you may be visiting or playing or working or living. So that's sort of the Strong Towns movement. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we weren't really talking about that in most corners of the US, but now it's becoming, at least I think, it's becoming more of a conversation and even sometimes a platform that people will run on. They'll sort of run on the Strong Towns movement of, I want a community that is more connected. I want a community that is more walkable. I want to be able to, my kids to ride their bikes to school. And I want to deprioritize vehicles in order to make, so that more comfortable, safer, things like that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, when I
Have you
think
guys
about
experienced this? You know this?
Oh, for sure. And as you're talking about this movement, I was thinking about a book I read in grad school by Thomas Hilton called Save Our
Yeah.
Land, Save Our Towns, which I think was written in or around the mid 80s. So, I think,
Yeah.
predated a lot of this push for multimodal connectivity, but it really had the same, kind of feel about it. It was, combating urban sprawl and a fight to kind of preserve that, American small town feel and heritage. I worry when I think about this subject that the result is gentrification and the unaffordability of some of these communities because the people that have the resources to live and invest in these places are going to drive real estate up and as a result may push out the people that can't otherwise afford to live there that need to live in more urban environments that don't have that infrastructure and connectivity. Perhaps they have transit, I don't know, but it's to me it seems like there's always a yin to every yang and in this case, the more we invest in this connectivity and infrastructure, the higher it drives housing prices and the more it's going to push out the people that need it the most because they don't have cars or other means of transportation.
And yes, I think what you just described, Dave, is what I've seen because I've been trying to follow on Substack. There's a lot of arguments about the Strong Town movement, and I can't figure out exactly like why would you be against this. I've been trying to sort of follow that. And I think you've described it, Dave. I think it is a thinking as a larger system that there's a little more complexity to this than just this, what we're going to do to our local space, which is a kind of value creation, which is nice, but not necessarily addressing the larger inequities and mobility issues.
I was a part of an equity conversation that was talking about this, right? And there was
Hmm.
one that side that was saying by making our community more connected, where you can use maybe an e-bike or you can walk or run or whatever around the community to access the things you're doing, you're actually sort of making the community less expensive because you don't need a car, which is a significant
Yes.
investment, right? You have
Yes.
this ability to sort of get around, in a way that is less expensive, that has sort of a less upfront cost. And the other side of the equity conversation was, well, no, a car is wealth building because now your job market is completely different, right? A 10-minute commute by car gets you a lot further than a 10-minute commute by e-bike or by walking or whatever. And so there were sort of two sides of that conversation because there was a person in the conversation that was sort of advocating for we should be eliminating parking, right? Like, we should not we should be making cars go the long way around. This was in another state where there's a personal property tax. They were saying, we should really raise the personal property tax significantly, where people start contemplating, do I really want to own this car? Maybe I should just get rid of it and lean into, different types of, transportation. And there's an environmental argument in there also. That they were sort of making. Now, I think those are the extreme sides, the extreme corners of the overall conversation. But I do think there's merit there. I think a car is wealth building for people, and I think we've talked about that on this podcast in the past, right?
Yeah.
I think that is important. However, providing options, for individuals, in more urban centers to be able to move around, whether it's by bus or subway or, e-bike or walking, that it does sort of create options that may not otherwise exist.
Yeah, and I think if I could name a central tension to this conversation, it is around how does local government policymaking actually shape the community and the culture, and one of the ways in which I look at this is when I think of my own story growing up in a middle class to upper class kind of neighborhood where I could, with a quarter, take the public bus downtown, that I didn't need a car when I graduated college. I went 3 years after college living in the inner harbor of Baltimore without a car. And I've written about this in Muni Square, how it was affordable. There was places to eat. I could get around very easily by bus or by train to other cities. It's changing now. That was during the time of Mayor Schaefer. The whole revamping of the Inner Harbor, which is to come, is going to be very exclusive. So to Dave's point,
Mhm.
there's what the decisions that we make in development and how we develop has a really huge impact. The example that I like best and I thought about this morning when I woke up, actually getting ready for this episode, was how if you remember the song My City Was Gone by the Pretenders, Chrissy Hynde wrote a song about how she went back to her hometown, Ohio, after being away. And it had literally, the farms had been replaced by shopping malls. That was my experience. And I remember going back to grad school in Columbus, Ohio, and the malls were just everywhere. And there were like 5-lane roads going down, 161 Morse Road. If you've ever been to Columbus, you've been on those roads. And I remember saying to my brother who lived there in Columbus, I said, all these people are like walking along the sides of these busy roads. And I feel like I'm going to hit them. Like, what are they doing? And he looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, Nancy, they're walking to work. They work at those malls. Now, that was at a flexion point where people were moving from, I can take a bus, I can get around, I can walk, to they're building malls out in the middle of these farms. And how do you get there? There's no
Right.
sidewalks, and
Right.
I can't afford a car. I'm working on minimum wage.
And if
Right, so
there
let's take
is
that the next step,
transit,
right? So, Dave, we've managed really small, resource-limited communities that does sort of have these employers in them, where people either in our communities or are coming to our communities to work, and there becomes a demand. I remember when I was in Greencastle, right? I was the manager. They had a sidewalk implementation program because there were no sidewalks outside of the immediate downtown. A very otherwise walkable community with low car traffic. You couldn't walk around. You were walking on like dirt paths in front of people's homes or on the streets. They were requiring sidewalks over a 5-year plan that the homeowners had to implement because they were trying to make it more walkability, right? I've been in boroughs where sort of the platform is, well, we just want to paint our crosswalks. We want painted crosswalks or we want decorative crosswalks because we're trying to make it safer for people to sort of move about that. Right. And as managers in resource limited towns, we sort of know that there's sort of multifacets here, right? It's yes, we don't have a lot of resources to do it. Yes, people are sort of coming to our town and moving around. Maybe not everyone in our town wants to move around, but we need to make this pedestrian infrastructure safer. Or maybe we need to make it exist. Like, how does that sort of play out? And how do you sort of weave the conversation with the community of you may not want this, but someone else does, and they have a right to belong here too? And then how do you sort of have the conversation about placemaking, right? About having decorative sidewalks? Maybe it feels kind of nice.
Yeah, I mean that's the the nice to have versus the need to have, the public safety for all versus why do I have to pay for somebody else's, transportate modes of transportation. I've also seen the situations where a new development comes in, a land development plan gets submitted or whatever it might be, single family home being built. Okay, you got to build sidewalks and the owner comes in and asks for an exemption because they say, well, there's no sidewalks on either side.
Oh,
So this
I
would
hate
just
that.
this would be a
Someone has to build the
sidewalk to
first
nowhere.
sidewalk. You
Exactly.
got to build the first sidewalk somewhere. If you build a sidewalk, then the next person will build a sidewalk, and it'll keep going. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, it's
But that's the
miserable.
that's the narrative that we have to, kind of struggle to overcome.
I have a community now. It's going to be an age-restricted community. There's sort of urban amenities on one side of it, and it backs up to an old, really nice subdivision with only two ways in and out on the other side. And then on that subdivision, there's a park. So it goes park, current subdivision, new subdivision, amenities, right? And so we're trying to connect the new subdivision to the amenities and to the new neighborhood because people are going to want to walk to the park. And so we had a community meeting and, over the series of long conversations, they're like, yeah, we walk to the park all the time. And I said, okay, don't you think they're going to want to walk to the park? They're like, we don't want them walking through our neighborhood. I was like,
Exactly.
come on. Like, like that. I mean, and I get it, right? The unknown, it's a beautiful farm field now. People have never lived there. I completely understand sort of the change aspect of it, right? I mean, they have this beautiful sort of quaint community, especially if you live in the back of the current subdivision, right, where there's no one there. And now there's going to be 120 homes of active adults who may be walking through their community, right? I mean, that is a challenge, right? And so I also said, well, don't you think you're going to walk to the amenities? No, never going to walk to the amenities. You probably are. Like eventually at some point you may say, I'm going to Wegmans for lunch. I'm going to the bagel shop. I'm going to go to that restaurant. It's a challenge. And so my old Parks and Rec director, he always used to say, and I agree with him, he said, in the comprehensive plan and in the parks, the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, it talks about trails and connectivities a lot. And it was very community led. The community was all for it. But when it comes time to build that trail in front of your house, all of a sudden your opinion changed. So he would say, you have to sell the romance. Sell the romance. He was like, it's all about sort of that global connectivity, being able to move around this community. Sell the romance. Yeah, you might not like this particular trail connection, but it really is about the bigger picture. I can't say that I'm great at selling the romance.
Well, and usually when the infrastructure is built and there's a realization that, from the NIMBYism movement, the not in my backyardists, that, hey, this really isn't going to be, collapsing of the quality of life as I know it. There tends to be, at least in my experience, more acceptance of it, but you got to overcome that initial resistance, which is always going to be there.
So how do you, when
It's
you're
expensive.
preparing sort of capital plans, budget documents, and making presentations, Dave, in these
Yeah.
communities, and you're thinking about sort of pedestrian infrastructure, you're thinking about bike lanes, sidewalks, crosswalks, decorative, crosswalks. How do you like, what do you do? Like, do you just put it in and say, I think we should do this, and here's why? Do you wait for there sort of to be a demand from the community? I mean, how do you approach that as the manager?
Yeah, I mean, I think planning is your best friend in this, and we do have some abilities to implement and develop small area plans for specific geographic areas that target multimodal activity that have opportunities for community input. I mean, I think you're exactly right. When people are faced with the option to include on a plan document shared use paths and bike lanes and sidewalks, you're going to be hard pressed to find anybody. I mean, certainly maybe some that really strongly object to it. But when it comes time to put that plan into motion, that's when you're really going to fight that resistance. But it doesn't, for me, it doesn't substitute the need to plan to go through those motions, because it is meaningful when you say, hey, you've had an opportunity to provide it. We've studied this. We know there's issues here. There's pedestrian safety issues. We know there's pedestrian activity here. We know there's multimodal activity. We really do need to start thinking about how we're going to provide for that infrastructure. And we have reduced that to writing through this process in a small area plan, in a, park master plan. And the municipality's planning code gives us some, and, for any of our out of state listeners, that's our, kind of planning document. We've talked about it before on the show that all municipalities, well, except for the city of brotherly love, have to follow.
That's
And
right.
that gives us some tools that we could, kind of leverage in our zoning ordinances to help make some of these, means of transportation more adaptable to new development, like the planned residential development process, like the traditional neighborhood development process. I don't know. Have you managed any communities that have had TNDs and PRDs and those kinds of ordinances?
Yes, we had a
What are your
TND.
experience with those?
I like them. All right. I mean, Kennett was
What's a
really
TND? What's a
it stands
TND?
for traditional neighborhood design. And then we had TDR ordinance, which is a transfer of development
Transfer
rights. And
development
so
right.
we married those. And so what that meant was we sort of had a TND in an area which was sort of the transitional area between the rural part of the township into the urban center, which was the borough, because Kennett Square Borough is a donut hole in Kennett Township. And so the TND is sort of a specific type of development that allows for, in that case, high density residential with different sets of parking requirements and some mixed use development, things like that. And to sort of promote the opportunity for density there, we sort of targeted through a transfer of development rights ordinance open space preservation. So we would entice a developer or somebody to preserve open space in a target area in the community, harvest the development rights from that, what was called a sending property, and then send them to a receiving property, which was also the T and D district, so that they could have more density
More
for more
density.
housing. So we were getting two things, right? We were preserving open space and reducing the opportunity for development in a target area of the township where there's less utilities and it's more rural and more farm fields, and then sort of centralizing and focusing development in an area where we sort of wanted to see growth
That's
moving
pretty
in towards
clever.
the borough.
Was it
Yeah,
successful? Was it a
yeah,
successful
absolutely.
project? That's
Yeah,
very
yeah,
cool.
yeah. Preserved a few hundred acres of open space, and the D&D was really tough, challenging ordinance, challenging to develop under, and it became more challenging as the developer started finding more people harvesting and trying to market TDRs.
Mm.
So that became interesting. But yeah, it was sort of a fun thing that we did. It's popular in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, so that's where
Right.
we sort of got that from.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've
It's very
managed
interesting trying to
communities.
implement all of these ordinances among all the other things that were happening in Kennett because it was at the same time.
Oh
So
my
in the
god,
same meeting, we would be like, "Yeah, so here's an update on the
on this
arrest and the recovery and all that kind
criminal.
of stuff. So let's talk about preserving open space." But to the point, you still have to pursue policy priorities, even though you're sort of operating the government in the day to day. So, a lot of
Hmm.
credit to the board for sort of having that foresight, right? Because with open space preservation, once it's gone, right? So you sort of have to move.
Yeah,
Little side
my
tangent there.
my experience with traditional neighborhood developments and planned residential and PRDs are, kind of similar in some veins to a traditional neighborhood development. There's a mixed use component to them, or at least there can be. It kind of gives more ability for contract zoning, in terms of negotiating the terms and conditions of the development itself. That's what got people a little bit nervous in some of the places that I've been with PRDs. And quite frankly, for good reason, because there was opportunities for the development community to take advantage of those loopholes, but they also provided for additional teeth to implement multimodal transportation infrastructure than you might otherwise get with your normal land development process. And TND is kind of the same concept. You have a scalable development where you can presumably walk to your retail and restaurant and places of business, whatever it might be, that's all kind of enclosed in one development plan. The challenge is, how do you control the phasing and implementation of it, because a developer is going to build their most profitable product, and who can blame them? So, out of the gate, and then there's no real ability that municipalities have to hold the feet to their fire to build the rest of the development. We can
Hmm.
revoke their grandfathered status. We can make them comply with new ordinances if they go too far out into the future. They can submit new phasing plans that can be approved or disapproved. But really, at the end of the day, for somebody who wants to just build the most profitable housing product that is in that market, they front load that initial phase or two of their development. There's nothing that really stops them from just saying, okay, well, I'm going to sit on the rest of it for, from now until the end of time. You can maneuver a little bit with development agreements and financial security and things like
I say
that,
there's financial security in play, development agreements, things like
Mhm.
that.
but it requires because you have the wherewithal to do all of those things. So that's
Sure.
another,
I agree with that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think that sort of gets into professional management, right? Which we are certainly promoters of. Not every municipality is professionally managed, but, having advisors, consultants, and a team in place that sort of understands the nuance of what we do and managing these governments and the enterprise around that is super important, right? I mean, having experts on your team, right? If you're an elected official listening to this podcast, make sure that you're sort of getting good advice, whether it's from your team of employees that are in your municipality or the consultants that you have or whoever that sort of understands the complexities around these things because it's our job to sort of protect the municipality and advocate for the residents, and engage in sort of thoughtful, smart, execution of policy priorities.
I would like to ask both of you where who were your best teachers in this area? Because I think about coming out of an MPA, you may have, some basic coursework on planning. It's you've been either around good planners or you've been involved in good discussions about this because it sounds very technical when you get down to the
It,
actual from an administrative point of
it,
view,
it is
bringing
very
all these
technical.
views together. Yeah.
It is very
How do you
technical.
and
I
the
would
elected
just say
officials, they don't have the expertise, as you
no, they
say.
don't. I said to an elected official recently, I said, "Why are you reading the fire code?" And it basically boiled down to lack of trust. I don't want to speak for this person, but lack of trust of the advice that they're getting from those that are around them, which is super challenging. So I think as a manager, like I don't expect to be an expert in the technical components of all of these things. I expect to sort of like take good advice from consultants who are sort of bona fide and trusted and have been vetted in other situations to ensure that we're sort of doing all the things that are necessary. And I think as time goes on, Dave would probably agree that, we're learning more, as every day goes by. We're sort of asking the right questions, making sure that things make sense, and that we're, sort of, not expecting to be the expert. If I'm in a room and I'm thinking I'm the smartest person in the room, that's not great.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I have a very talented team here, where I work now, of consultants, of staff. And I've had that in many of the places that I've been, and just making sure that they're all enabled to speak up, speak their mind about what they think needs to happen, with whatever the issue is that we're dealing with. My job is to sort of like grease the skids and give them the resources they need to be successful because ultimately that's going to be in the best interest of the community.
But how do you know when there's red flags? So you're coming up and you are going through this process. And I'm thinking about, I think I mentioned in a preliminary text you guys before the episode that having a good developer a good working relationship, how do you know that that's maybe something is not
Mm,
aligning? Maybe there's a more of a leaning towards a particular
yeah,
interest or agenda or just sort of profit driven as opposed to meeting what you believe is really the
Yeah.
intention of the community. Are
I
there red
think
flags?
there's no substitute for experience, and that's going to vary by community. You gotta get to know the development community in your municipality. You've got to go through a couple of projects with them, and I mean, I kind of cut my teeth in the State College, Pennsylvania area, which is town gown, surrounds Penn State University, bedroom community, about 24,000 or well, less than 24,000 residents, and a lot of housing development. Housing in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania is just stupefying in terms of the price points that you see. And there's really no single explanation to it. And that's coming from somebody who's been there for over a decade, where, people will say, well, it's because there's a university. Yeah, okay, well, that's a part of it. But there's also a lot of other influences that go into the elevation of the housing prices and the housing market in that area. And it's partly been driven by the development community themselves. And I've had in my career opportunities to go through some pretty intensely litigated land development plans, some that have went all the way to the state Supreme Court. And, because quite frankly, there's a lot of mistrust of the development community in, where I,
Yes.
kind of got my experience. And so every land development plan, any encroachment on what was perceived to be green space or open space was met with a lot of resistance, whether it was informed or not. And oftentimes it wasn't, although sometimes it was. But it's not it doesn't cost much to litigate a land development, to file something in the Court of Common Pleas in the county or up to the Commonwealth Court. So just going through some of those experiences gave me more exposure to the municipality's planning code and to land use law in Pennsylvania. I've had times where I've been the interim or acting director of planning, even though I had no coursework in it. But I think that baptism by fire, and I had a particularly challenging one. It was a PRD that went to the state Supreme Court over a student housing product that had some ties to a regional park amenity. It's a fascinating story, but it's probably would be the world's most boring book. But if you're interested in looking into it, it's the Toll Brothers, which is a pretty renowned developer.
Yeah.
The development that they did in State College, a student housing product. No shade on Toll Brothers, but that they just happened to be the developer. It could have been anybody, and it would have been met with the same kind of resistance. So you learn how to kind of look for those stress fractures because you know where your community is going to be the most fired up about them, and you could try to kind of counter that narrative, but you can only do so much. At the end of the day, that sentiment is going to be what pushes forward from the community.
Dave, how do you, when you're working with a developer and you sort of reach the conclusion that whatever they're proposing is right, correct, if it's appropriate within the limitations of, local code, but the board disagrees? What do you do? Do you sort of say to the board, no, do you provide that education to help them sort of understand that the situation you're in is sort of appropriate given the dynamic? I mean, how do you go about that?
You mean if they've met all of your regulations and they're sort of
But someone still
entitled
wants
to
to
an
say
approval,
no?
but somebody wants to say no?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you provide.
That's the 12th hour vote, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you provide that background. You can, kind of reference what your expectations are for evaluation of a land development plan in a property rights state as Pennsylvania is, and I anticipate most states are. There are the potential legal and liability issues around, denying somebody the right to develop their property when they conform to your subdivision land development standards, your zoning standards, and they've gone through the process, and that they're entitled to, an opportunity to cure any deficiencies. So saying no to somebody, even if it is grounded in your code somewhere, doesn't necessarily mean that, they have to go somewhere else or that they're not able to proceed. But if there's still going to be a no vote, I mean, that then becomes our obligation to implement and to get behind. It is a challenging balance. Thankfully, that situation, I've had individual votes no on land development plans that otherwise conform to our standards, but never anything that has in that manner killed a project. Other kinds of issues that are sort of related to that. Quick example, the project that was student housing project, met all of our conditions, had final land development plan approval or, final PRD approval in this case, had to, as part of that approval, cure an easement for a water line, for a sewer line, on the adjacent piece of land that was owned by the municipal water authority or the regional water authority. That water authority denied them that easement, essentially denying them the ability to proceed with that land development plan. So in that case, it was more of a conversation with my board about, look, we kind of hamstrung this development. We approved it, but we approved it with a condition that they're not able to meet. So now we kind of need to consider alternative routes for them to go that circumvent the need for that easement. And that was enormously controversial because that
that's
balances
so hard.
the use by right versus no, they're not entitled to occupy the right of way or to go through the. So it really almost brought the whole thing to a screeching halt and further litigated an already very contentious development.
Yeah, I rely on my solicitor and engineers in those moments, right? I mean, if the three of you can sort of stand shoulder to shoulder to sort of explain that dynamic, explain how you arrived in that situation and what, the path forward should be. I always say sort of the solicitor is there to keep you out of trouble. This is the path to take in order to stay out of trouble. You may not like it, but sort of leadership and governing does require making difficult decisions from time to time. I mean, I think that that's a good approach, but it is really hard, especially when the governing body has one expectation and you have to sort of come back for some reason and say, hey, that expectation you had is no longer going to be realized. We have to go a different way. And that's where I think a lot of education, transparency, engagement, and sort of going the extra mile to tell the story, to explain the situation, to allow the members of the audience to follow along and meaningfully participate sort of helps with that.
Have you ever had elected officials run solely, almost exclusively in opposition to a proposed development plan?
Yes. Yep.
That's a fun one, huh?
It is. I actually meet with candidates before the election to do sort of like a mini onboarding of this is what you're getting into. This is the role of an elected official. I involve
Mhm.
department heads. It's a lot of fun. We do some fun things. Elected officials always like to try on fire gear. That's a thing. So we set that up. Look at police cars up close, things like that.
Touch a truck. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, those are always a good time. And I sort of start the conversation of like, what are your priorities? What would you like to talk about? And because I don't really follow the campaigns, I try not to pay attention to it. That's not our job as apolitical managers. And frankly, it'll just give you a headache sometimes. But that's usually when that comes out. And then after the election, I sort of start getting real of, okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about your role. Let's talk about the staff's role. Let's talk about how these things happen. And it will come up, right? I had a new elected official now who intended at reorganization to basically say, builders, get out of our community. I'm not approving anything. And I
Mhm.
just sort of gently said, okay, well, let's talk about the rules and regulations, right? We don't just get to do whatever we want. There are codes that we follow. There's laws and regulations and this kind of stuff. And sort of started to unpack all of that. And there was a realization. I mean, this elected official is very good and super reasonable. Of oh, I can't say that. I said, no, you can't. Like that's just not how it works. There are personal property rights people can develop. The government can't just say no. That's sort of not how it works. There are things that we can do, and we can certainly exercise some of those levers and tools and plans that we have in order to try to achieve your policy priorities. If you can get a majority of the board on your side, this is how to do that. In sort of an intelligent and meaningful way. So I think it's just education, meeting elected officials where they are. I think sometimes managers get themselves into trouble when they assume that they, as the manager's expertise, is just going to be accepted and that elected officials are just going to do what we say. That's not going to happen. And then two, when we expect elected officials to come in knowing everything, that's also not going to happen. So it's our
Right.
job to sort of provide that information, provide that education, and to help them, sort of achieve their policy priorities, right? This is their communities. We work for them and should help them be successful.
I am curious, though, from both of your experiences when you have traveled about wherever, what has excited you? Going back to this idea of connectivity, what have you seen in other places that you've thought, man, that is a great example of connectivity that I would love to see in the community I manage? What are some examples?
Vancouver. Have you ever been to Vancouver?
No? What's there?
Absolutely, to me, the prototypical, example of multimodal connectivity. You almost think that I can't imagine how they built this city in the time when they built it, because the streets are wide enough to accommodate dedicated bike lanes and walk lanes and cartways for vehicles and sidewalks. And I mean, they're just, you look at built environments in urban areas in Pennsylvania and around the country, and I mean, I'm sure there are examples that that are out there where they really have done it right, but they just seem so noisy and congested. And you wonder, how are
Yeah.
you going to retrofit a complete streets concept in a concrete canyon where the buildings are only maybe 30 feet apart from one another, and the cartways are it's across the street, and the cartways are 20 foot curb to curb, and basically you've got a little 8 foot sidewalk at best, or a 5 foot sidewalk or less. And it's just, but Vancouver to me was, and I was only there once for a couple of days. I didn't get to poke around the whole city, but where I was, every time I turned around, it didn't matter what street it was, whether it was a, kind of an arterial corridor in the city, or it was kind of another, offshoot or a sub street. There was always some acknowledgement or some amenity there that was designed to encourage multimodal transportation. They were really, those British Columbians were really forward thinking in how they planned for their
Practical.
urban environment.
Yeah. What
I-
about
I'll
you,
take the
Ian?
question a different way. I really like working and visiting sort of built out, I don't want to say built out, but sort of older communities that have been there a while that are trying to transition to allow pedestrian infrastructure, right? Like the borough of Phoenixville in Chester County, Pennsylvania is
Yeah,
a great borough. Their
definitely.
downtown is super fun. It is absolutely prioritizing pedestrians. They paint the crosswalks, the streets are cool. They've narrowed sort of the main street to allow for on-street dining. It's really difficult to drive a car through Phoenixville. And I know people who live there and they're like, it is miserable going 1 mile because the streets are so narrow. I'm like, great, let it be for the
Yeah.
pedestrians. Let them have a good time downtown. It is such a cool vibe, right? Kennett, where I worked, is in the process of building a 14-mile greenway that will connect multiple rural amenities to the urban downtown. They're making progress on it, right? We built the first mile and a half while I was there, and like people are giving up easements. They're sort of cooperating with it. They're informing the trail design. They're doing all sorts of things to sort of connect, right? Well, Kennett's an old community. It's been there for a long time, right? So it's narrow streets. It's sort of, very rural, up against, creeks all the time. So sort of figuring out how do you retrofit this into existing, right? I think that's super important.
Yeah.
Greencastle making, a decision, a small town with a small budget, just saying, hey, we want to be able to walk amongst ourselves for each other. How do we figure this out? I think that's so much fun. The city of Charlottesville, right? I mean, they're the Neighborhood Development Services, which is their planning and zoning department, has an entire bike team of people just trying to help you get around the city on a bike, on an e-bike, on existing streets that have been there for a long time with housing and businesses, development on either side, just making it more comfortable to move around. I mean, just being a part of, those sort of initiatives to help, connectivity of people who've already been in a place for a long time, but are trying to find, places and spaces that they can connect to in their communities. I
Yeah.
love being a part of that.
Yeah, super cool. Phoenixville's a great example.
Yeah. I love Phoenixville.
Shout out
Yeah.
to Gene Crack.
Talk about another legend.
Another OG, yeah.
Yeah, no kidding.
And fellow guitarist.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to visit there. Borough of Media, we did a great episode as well.
Media's great.
Really, really great episode.
Have you spoken with the new mayor of Media? We should get her on the podcast.
That's
Joy
good.
Washington
Let's do
is
it.
incredible. She was in, I taught a newly elected municipal officials class one in Berks County, one in Delaware County for PSAB, Pennsylvania State Association of Boroughs. And I met her in that class. She's amazing. So much energy.
Wow.
So excited to promote the borough. I mean, just celebrating businesses and just sort of getting out there and connecting with people. I mean, she's incredible. I love watching her journey.
Well, I want to also mention a very bold vision. One of my favorite cities in the world is Barcelona. Now, they have had a huge movement against tourism of late, which I would like to dig into and get to the heart of, because I think that has impacted their affordability. But they were so bold within their grid structure to just block off an entire street and make it pedestrian. They just made it a greenway. So you take an old city that is just used to extensive traffic down a main way. Now, La Rambla is very famous. We know about that connects the coast up to the center of Barcelona. But this other idea is back into the business district, business commercial district, just an entire block. Imagine that in New York City, just the entire block developed into a greenway. So I love that bold concept. And I think that the other idea coming from Europe that we see little bits of in this country, but I would love to see more of, is just that central plaza, that there's a place that's in the center, that's pedestrian, that is sort of circular, that says this is where people meet, this is an open public space, and it doesn't have to always be busy, but sometimes it is during different times of the day. Other times it's really quiet. You can sit for as long as you like, maybe get a cup of coffee. Those sort of spaces, I think, are just
I completely agree. Some of my best memories of London are just sitting in some of the parklets they have, having breakfast, just watching the world go by, right?
Yeah.
Sitting in green space surrounded by, sort of urbanness, that is the city of
Yes.
London, just sort of having an English breakfast and coffee and just, relaxing, in a park on a bench and, enjoying the sunshine.
Yeah,
mean,
and
that's
not having
incredible.
to spend a fortune just to sit
No,
there. You
no.
know, that's a big piece of
You know,
it.
The hard part about building those senses of places and town centers that I've observed over the years has been, it's kind of a field of dreams scenario where you want to, it's some of the development community, they expect that volume of traffic to be there. They want to be able to demonstrate
Yes.
that their pro forma is going to be met and that they're going to get their, the profitability so that they can in turn, and I'm not blaming them for this, they want to be able to market that product to their prospective tenants. Hey, come and have a small retail shop here, have a corner cafe, because I can demonstrate that we have the trips here that's going to sustain that product. But that's not always the case. You've got to take a risk. You've got to build in some of those areas with the understanding that you're going to draw people in. And it's a big struggle, in my opinion, in bigger communities, geographically larger communities, because you don't necessarily have that ability to, walk to that town center if you live in the peripheral, kind of areas of the town or at the edge of town or the municipality. Tom Comita, if any of you know him, he's a landscape architect in
Tom Comita is who we worked with in Kennett to do a lot of the
Philadelphia
stuff I
area.
talked about earlier.
Tom Comita, brilliant
Amazing.
mind.
Oh yeah,
The guy could
amazing.
tell you what he had for breakfast in like April of 1972. And he just remembers everything. And his brain's a sponge. He knows street geometries from the Milan, and the just unbelievable, the wealth of knowledge in this guy's head. And I partnered with him on a project to try to improve a mixed use corridor that kind of leads into the downtown area of State College, into State College Borough. And we struggled with getting the numbers to make sense because you just couldn't entice people to walk that distance. There wasn't any evidence that people were going to be able to navigate in a multimodal transportation kind of way the entirety of that corridor in a way that would encourage economic development. But I kept coming back to, well, let's just build it. What's to say that? How do you know that? And, unfortunately, that narrative kind of carried the day. It's still not built out. There's still a lot of struggles there, a lot of urban blight. It's a chicken and egg kind of thing. You got to really be partnered with a developer that's going to be willing to take a little risk.
Did you build it?
No. And that'd be a whole episode for another conversation, because there was a lot of there's a lot of variables that affected the growth of that corridor, not the least of which being its proximity to Penn State's West Campus. So the property owners along that street had very delusional opinions about their property values. So their expectations for sales to, selling their homes to, prospective developers was just a non-starter for most of the development community in State College. Zoning was restrictive. There was issues with the streetscape itself and expectations that we had. So a lot of things contributed to the failure of that effort. But I think the main reason why it never took off was because we couldn't get the development community on board with the potential to build the kind of volume and trip generation needed to sustain businesses along that corridor, because it didn't exist before the pre-existing condition didn't show that.
Yeah. I think
Interesting.
the larger issue within the system is how to sustain small businesses. It's very difficult to do in the profit-driven world of development right now. And I don't know if it means more public investment needed. I think that's what happens in larger cities. Of course, they have more resources. But once you have a public investment, you can say, now what we really want is to draw people. And if that's a coffee shop, there are people that are willing to work many, many hours just to make a living. Just that's what I call that subsistence economy. Just enough to feed their families. They're okay with that. They're not out for big profits, but we don't even let them survive because it becomes too expensive to pay the rent to have
Right.
that shop, or the developers don't want them because it's not a guaranteed profit. But if you go to Europe, I mean, you see these shops all the time, little bars that, just people linger.
So
It's not a profit-driven enterprise.
one of
It's
the
no.
strong town conversations is about parking requirements, right?
Mhm.
And mandatory parking minimums. There is so much parking in the United States, because we are so afraid that we're not going to be able to park our cars, that we're not going to be able to take our cars, that we're going to be sitting in traffic because people are trying to find a place to park. And so the problem is we take up so much real estate, creating places for us to park our cars on the busiest day that we would ever visit somewhere, that we're driving up the price of other real estate to develop, which is a barrier to entry for someone for a small
Yeah.
business, right? And so that's like a question, right? I mean, if you start reducing parking requirements, does that make it easier to open that small coffee shop, right? One of my favorite coffee
Yeah.
shops where I live now doesn't have a lot of parking there. Sometimes I drive around, but I still go there because I love the coffee shop, right? I'm not going to not go, because parking is going to be challenging.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that there's sort of a push-pull about that. And I think in small towns, especially in small boroughs in Pennsylvania, that's a conversation I've had with borough councils. They're like, well, there's just going to be this development. What if everyone has their entire family over for Thanksgiving? We need enough parking because then they're going to spill into the streets and that's going to disrupt the owners. And it's like, what's the opportunity cost of building all that? I don't know if you
Yeah.
People
guys,
will figure it out. People will adapt.
they
That's
do.
my belief.
They do.
And a lot of, I think, the magic in enticing or enabling those kinds of small business development opportunities starts with your land development standards. I mean, you can incentivize streetscape and design standards improvements and parking reductions and all of these things. I mean, there is the ability that we have in Pennsylvania, at least, to do a little bit of, I hesitate to call it quid pro quo, but you give us a little bit, more in streetscape amenities and we'll agree to
Mhm.
reducing your parking standards. I mean, that all has
Yeah,
to be codified. That
Yeah,
can't
the
just be.
problem is, Dave, like you have to have significant ability to sort of get to that point in the conversation. Like there's significant upfront
Mhm.
costs that have to be sunk just to get to that part of the conversation with the
Mhm.
governing, with the local
Yes.
government to be able to reduce parking requirements. If you're a small business trying to open a coffee shop that says, okay, well, because I'm going to be in the downtown, I have to have offsite for 7 spaces. I can't afford that kind of real estate. You're just not going to have the conversation. There will be no coffee shop,
Right.
right? We're incentivizing large development, commercial developers who are doing this on a much larger scale, not, the mom and pop LLC.
And it's a great kind of admonishment to the next generation of managers to say, look, you do need to have in this job, doesn't matter where you are, a working knowledge of what those development tools are. And you need to be thinking prospectively, not reactively, to how you can enable those conversations to be had more quickly than the process would otherwise permit. So always be thinking about, it's one of the best lessons I learned from my mentor in municipal management was to always be thinking about the year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, because if we are so laser focused on the issues that are in front of our nose today, we're not going to be setting our communities up for success in the years ahead.
One of the things that the city of
Absolutely.
Charlottesville did that, by the way, I had no role in any of this. It just happened. And I think it's super cool and I love it. Is they got rid of parking requirements. There's no parking minimums. They essentially leave it up to the developer to figure it out. They made housing by right in every zoning district. And where there is housing, they allowed ADUs by right,
Yeah,
accessory dwelling
accessory
units
dwelling units.
in every unit, right? There's some constraints, setbacks and things like that, but you can do it. It's a by right allowance. They are trying to increase the housing supply in a very expensive real estate market.
Yeah.
And it's there.
It's good.
ADUs are
Good
that
news.
next, they're that
They're
next
coming.
thing. They're
Oh, yeah.
coming. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so Virginia has automatic reassessments, unlike Pennsylvania, right? So
Nice.
as the cost of real estate goes up, your taxable liability goes up significantly, and they reassess every other year. And so there are people who are in houses that were once affordable to them that are no longer affordable to them, because they simply live in a desirable market. And so the idea of ADUs is, okay, well, I could choose to take my property, build an ADU, rent that out for additional income, right? I mean, there are some people in that city having that conversation also.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting
Wow.
dynamic.
Yeah,
And
very
I will
interesting.
say, as an outsider who has lived there and spent some time there, it didn't ruin the city. If anything, I thought it was a major enhancement. So for anyone sort of thinking about those things, they did not ruin the city because there's no parking requirements. People work it out.
Yeah, love it. It's a great
Mhm.
So
place to end.
55 minutes in, fun episode. I'm
Yeah.
not sure how much we solved, but I enjoyed sort of the conversation.
Yeah. I
Dave,
love getting
Nancy,
this.
any closing thoughts here?
Mm.
Mm.
Well, my other song from my generation was from Big Yellow Taxi, Joni Mitchell. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. That was our, sort of mantra. We saw it coming and we didn't probably do our part as far as speaking for my generation. I wish we would have done more to protest, but here we are.
I mean, there's no one size fits all solution to, the needs to enable a multimodally connected community. And you have to be able to balance the interests or the need for profit for the development community. I know it seems in a lot of these municipalities to be, a Faustian pact that deal with the devil, that like, hey, I don't want to give you any, like you should be thanking me for the privilege of building in my municipality. How dare you come and ask for relief in permitting costs or assistance
Yeah.
in, navigating the process or whatever? Figure it out. You're going to make money hand over fist. Well, that's fine if you want to have the moral high ground, but the reality is, in many cases, that's just going to entice the developer to go elsewhere, and you're going to lose that growth. You may be okay with that, but as time builds on time and your costs go up to run and manage your communities, you're going to need that sustainable growth model. So you have to be willing to talk within the confines of what you can legally do. I am not advocating for contract zoning or anything that is below board, but you do need to use the tools that are at your disposal and realize that if you want to encourage and enable more affordable housing in your communities, and if you want to combat gentrification that may result from some of the amenities that we talked about on this episode, you got to be willing to make concessions in the interest of enabling that growth in the way that the community's vision is. So, make sure you have that working knowledge of what tools are at your disposal. Make sure you're, engaging with your elected officials and your community about the pros and cons of making a decision one way or the other, so that at least there's an understanding. I mean, if at the end of the day the decision is what it is, that you made it a good faith effort to help, kind of build that development and make it work for the town.
Yep, I agree. Understand what
Yeah.
your options are. Listen to the experts that you have as elected officials. Try to communicate your vision and build partnership with the developers, because developers want to be successful too, and they're going to be looking to the government for guidance in order to sort of figure out what that looks like. So with
Right.
that, that's another installment of Generation on the Rise. Dave, Nancy, thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation. We will see everyone next week.
And
Yeah.
go
Thanks,
Phillies.
Ian.
Go
Great
Phillies.
topic. See ya. Bye.